She was 31, and the man she had trusted most in the world had been lying to her for 12 years. She did not know this yet. She knew only that her father was dead, that the will had been read, and that Mr. Gerald Payne, solicitor, family friend, the man who had managed her father's affairs since before Louisa was born, was sitting across the desk from her in his York office with the expression of a man delivering unwelcome news he has already decided how to frame. The estate, such as it was, had been modest. Her father, a retired schoolmaster named Arthur Fenwick, had lived carefully and without excess, and what he left behind reflected this: a small terraced house in York, which carried a mortgage that nearly cancelled its value, a sum in the savings bank of £83, his books, his instruments, his modest furniture, and one other thing, a cottage on the North Yorkshire coast, near the village of Steinwick, which Mr. Payne now described, with the smooth regret of a man who has rehearsed the description, as being in very poor condition, quite remote, and of negligible market value. He advised her to sell it. He had, in fact, already taken the liberty of making an inquiry with a local land agent, purely informally, of course, nothing binding, and the agent's opinion was that the land alone might fetch £25 to £30, the building being in such a state that it would likely be demolished by any purchaser. He slid a piece of paper across the desk, the agent's estimate, typed on headed paper, the figure at the bottom exactly as he had described. Louisa looked at the figure. She looked at Mr. Payne. She said she would like to see the cottage before she decided. Mr. Payne's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A small adjustment in the set of his mouth smoothed away so quickly she might have imagined it. He said, of course, entirely her decision, though the journey was rather long and the roads in that part of the coast were not good in November, and the building itself was likely to be a disappointment. He would be happy to handle the sale on her behalf, save her the trouble entirely. Louisa said she would like to see it. She had learned this quality from her father. Arthur Fenwick had taught mathematics and natural science for 31 years, and had raised his daughter alone after her mother's death, and the thing he had given her above all others was the habit of looking at what was actually in front of her, rather than at the explanation being offered for it. The answer that comes too quickly, he used to say, is usually someone else's answer. Look at the thing itself. She took the train to Whitby and hired a cart to Steinwick, a village of 40 souls on a headland above the sea. The driver told her the cottage had stood empty for 11 years, that old Mr. Fenwick had come out once or twice in the early years, but not recently, 11 years. Her father had owned the cottage for at least 11 years, and had mentioned it to her perhaps twice in passing. She had not asked to see it. She had trusted that her father and his solicitor had an accurate picture of its value, and had not pressed the point. The cottage came into view as the cart rounded the last headland, a low stone building set back from the cliff edge, 100 yards above the sea. Steinwick sandstone, the same warm grey-brown as everything else on this coast, with a slate roof and 2 windows facing south and one facing the sea. It was larger than she had expected. Not large, 2 rooms down, 2 up, but not the ruin Mr. Payne had implied. The roof was intact. The walls were sound. The windows were intact on the ground floor, one cracked on the upper, the garden overgrown, but the stone boundary wall still standing. She paid Coates and walked to the door and stood for a moment looking at it. The sea was visible from the path, grey-green, November, the wind off it cold and clean. Below the headland, the village was a cluster of chimneys and a church tower. Above, the sky was the particular shade of white that preceded snow. She found the key in her coat pocket. Mr. Payne had produced it at the end of their meeting, a small iron key on a leather fob, worn smooth from handling, and she opened the door. The interior was cold and smelled of salt and old paper, and the particular damp of a building that has been sealed against weather, but not against time. 2 rooms on the ground floor, a sitting room with a stone fireplace and 2 south-facing windows, and a study at the back, smaller, with a wooden desk against the wall and shelving on 2 sides. The shelves in the sitting room held nothing. The shelves in the study held books. Her father's books. She recognized several of the spines: geological surveys, coastal mapping reports, a mineralogical handbook with the cover worn off. She stood in the study doorway and looked at the books. Geological surveys, coastal mapping, mineralogy. Her father had been a schoolmaster, not a geologist. He had kept no such books in the York house. She crossed to the shelf and took down the nearest volume, a survey of the North Yorkshire coast, published 1859, and opened it to the fly-leaf. In her father's hand, a date, October 1860, and below it, underlined once, Steinwick, P47. She found page 47. It described the geological formation of the headland above Steinwick village, a particular configuration of Carboniferous limestone overlying a coal-bearing stratum, the seam running east-west below the cliff at an estimated depth of 60 to 80 feet. The survey noted that the formation had not been commercially exploited, but that a preliminary assessment suggested a seam of considerable quality and extent, comparable to productive workings further inland in the West Riding. She set the book down and took down the next one. It took her the better part of the afternoon to understand what she was reading. She was not a geologist. She was a schoolmaster's daughter who had absorbed, through proximity and her father's habit of explaining things, a working knowledge of how to read a technical document. And these documents, once she had the vocabulary of them, were not obscure. They said, in the careful language of Victorian scientific survey, that the land beneath the Steinwick, Cottage and the headland it stood on sat above, one of the more significant, unmined coal deposits on the North Yorkshire coast. The most recent document on the shelf was not a published survey. It was a report, typed on plain paper, no letterhead, dated the 14th of March, 1860, commissioned, she could see from the cover page, by one Gerald Payne, solicitor, on behalf of his client Arthur Fenwick, regarding a preliminary assessment of mineral rights and extraction potential on land at Steinwick, North Yorkshire. Gerald Payne, her father's solicitor, the man who had just told her the cottage was worth £25 to £30 and advised her to sell. She sat down at her father's desk and read the report from the first page to the last. The report was 41 pages. She read it twice. It had been prepared in 1860 by a mining engineer named Thomas Arkwright of Sheffield, commissioned through Mr. Payne on behalf of her father. It assessed the mineral content of the Steinwick headland, the depth and extent of the coal seam, the likely cost of sinking a shaft to reach it, the probable yield per annum once working, and the current market rate for coal of this grade in the North Yorkshire and Durham markets. The conclusion, stated on the final page in the measured language of a professional who understood the weight of his words, was as follows. The Steinwick deposit, if the preliminary survey was confirmed by deeper boring, represented a seam of significant commercial value. Estimated yield, once operational, between 800 and 1,200 tons per annum. At current market prices, this represented a gross annual income of between £400 and £600. The mineral rights, if offered for lease to a mining concern, could command a premium of between £2,000 and £3,000, with ongoing royalty payments thereafter, £2,000 to £3,000. She sat with this figure for a long time in the cold study, with the sea audible below the headland. She thought about what Mr. Payne had said. £25 to £30, the land alone, the building to be demolished. She thought about the date on the report, March 1860, 12 years ago. Her father had commissioned this report 12 years ago. He had known what the land was worth, or might be worth, for 12 years. And he had never told her, and Mr. Payne, who had commissioned the report on his behalf, had also never told her, and had just advised her to sell the property for £30. The question of why her father had said nothing was one she could not answer from documents alone, and she set it aside for the moment. Her father was dead, and she could not ask him, and the explanations that offered themselves, that he had been uncertain, that he had been cautious, that he had intended to act and had not gotten around to it, were all possible and none of them answerable. Her father had been a careful man in some ways and a procrastinating one in others, and she had loved him, and she was not going to understand his reasons from a reading chair in his empty study. The question of Mr. Payne was different. Mr. Payne was alive. Mr. Payne had the report in his files, had commissioned it himself, which meant he had a copy, had always had a copy, and Mr. Payne had sat across the desk from her 3 days ago and described the property as being of negligible market value and advised her to sell it for £30 to a buyer who would demolish the building. She opened the desk drawers. There were 3 on the right side and 2 on the left. The top 3 held the ordinary contents of a working desk: pen nibs, a broken pencil, a small ruler, a bottle of dried ink. The left upper drawer held a folded map of the Steinwick headland, hand-annotated in her father's cramped hand, with measurements and compass bearings marked along the cliff edge and across the heathland above. The left lower drawer was locked. She did not have a key for it. She looked at the lock, a small brass mechanism, the kind used in household desks throughout the century. She had no suitable tool in her coat pocket or her bag. She went to the sitting room and looked at the fireplace tools: a poker, a small shovel, a pair of tongs. She took the poker back to the study and worked its flat end into the gap between the drawer's top edge and the desk frame, and she applied pressure. The lock was not strong. After 3 attempts, the mechanism gave and the drawer slid open. Inside, a single envelope, unsealed. Her name on the front in her father's handwriting: Louisa. She sat down and took out the letter. It was 2 pages, in her father's hand, dated the previous January, 10 months before his death. My dear Louisa, if you are reading this, you have done what I hoped you would do, and gone to the cottage rather than taking Gerald's advice. I am sorry to have made it complicated. I should have told you directly, and I could not find the way. The cottage and the headland are worth considerably more than Gerald will have told you. I know this because I commissioned a survey in 1860, and the results were what you will have found on the shelf. I did not act on them at the time because I was uncertain, and because Gerald advised caution. He said the market for coal leases was depressed, and that we should wait. I waited, and then more years passed, and I became less certain of the right course, and more uncertain of my own judgment, as old men do, and Gerald continued to advise patience, and I continued to wait. Last year I began to understand that Gerald's patience had a different quality from mine. I asked to see the correspondence file on the Steinwick property. He produced it, but it was thinner than it should have been. I could not prove anything, but I had been watching Gerald for 40 years, and I know when a file has been managed. I believe Gerald intends to acquire the property himself, or on behalf of a client, at the lowest possible price, once it passes to you and he has advised you to sell quickly. I cannot prove this, but I am putting the report where you will find it if you go to the cottage, and I am putting this letter where you will find it if you look further than Gerald expects you to look. You are always better at looking than he knows. Go to a different solicitor, not anyone Gerald has recommended. Take the report. Your loving father, Arthur. She read the letter once. She folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her coat pocket. She sat for a moment in the cold study. Her father had known. He had suspected at least, had suspected enough to hide the evidence and write the letter and leave it for her to find. He had not been able to confront Gerald Payne directly, had not been able to prove what he suspected, but he had done the one thing he could do. He had trusted her to go and look for herself. You were always better at looking than he knows. She stood up. She took the Arkwright report from the shelf and wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth she found in the kitchen. She took the annotated headland map from the upper left drawer. She took her father's letter in her coat pocket. She locked the cottage door behind her and walked back along the headland path towards Stainwick, the sea below her and the sky white with the promise of snow. She went to Whitby that evening and read the Arkwright report again with a geological dictionary bought from the Whitby bookshop. By the end of the evening, she understood it well enough to know what questions to ask. She also visited the Whitby Land Registry office. The title records for the Stainwick headland confirmed the cottage and 14 acres in her father's name. The mineral rights were attached to the freehold. She had not known to look for this before, but she looked now, and they were there. She wrote in her small notebook, "Mineral rights attached to freehold." Arkwright report, 2,000–3,000 lease premium, 400–600 annual royalty. Payne's valuation, 25 to 30. Below this she wrote, "Find a solicitor in Whitby." She found one the following morning. His name was Mr. Holt, Edward Holt of Holt and Carver, Church Street, Whitby, a man of 55 with the weathered look of someone who had spent his career dealing with the practical realities of the North Yorkshire coast. Fishing rights, cliff erosion, shipping disputes, the occasional wreck. He was not the most fashionable solicitor she might have found, but he had the specific quality she needed. He had no connection to Gerald Payne. And when she laid the Arkwright report and her father's letter on his desk and explained the situation, he read them with the focused attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. He asked her 3 questions. Whether the mineral rights were confirmed as attached to the freehold, she showed him the land registry entry. Whether the Arkwright report had been commissioned through Payne's office, the cover page confirmed this. Whether she had any other evidence of Payne's conduct, beyond the thinness of the correspondence file her father had noted, she did not. Not yet. Mr. Holt said that what she had was significant. The report alone, a survey commissioned 12 years ago and never disclosed to the property owner, despite its relevance to any valuation, was, in his opinion, a serious breach of the duty a solicitor owed his client. Whether it rose to the level of actionable misconduct depended on what the correspondence file contained, and on whether Payne had made any representations to potential buyers about the property that were inconsistent with what the report showed. He suggested they proceed in 2 directions simultaneously. First, a formal request to Payne's office for the complete Stainwick correspondence file, which Payne was legally required to produce. Second, a new independent valuation of the property and its mineral rights by a mining engineer with no connection to either party. He could recommend an engineer, a man named Forsyth, who worked out of Middlesbrough and had assessed several North Yorkshire coastal properties. The valuation would take 3 to 4 weeks. She agreed to both. She paid his retainer from the £83 in the savings bank, which left her careful but not desperate, and she went back to York and waited. The correspondence file arrived at Mr. Holt's office within the week. It was, as her father had noted, thin. 11 years of file on a property of this nature should have run to several inches of correspondence. What Payne had produced was a single folder, perhaps 20 pages, covering routine matters: the original purchase, the rates assessments, 1 letter about roof repair. No mention of the Arkwright report, no record of any valuation inquiry, no correspondence about mineral rights. Mr. Holt wrote to Louisa. The file had been managed. The Arkwright report should have been in it. Its absence, combined with its existence, was the evidence. The Forsyth valuation came in 4 weeks later, in December. Forsyth had bored 2 tests, holes on the headland, with Louisa's written, permission and the village. Blacksmith's assistance, and his findings, confirmed and extended Arkwright's 12-year-old assessment. The seam was real, it was accessible, and at current prices, The lease premium had risen from Arkwright's estimate of £2,000 to £3,000 to a figure between £4,000 and £5,000, reflecting 12 years of coal price inflation and the depletion of competing seams further inland. £4,000 to £5,000. Mr. Holt sent a formal letter to Gerald Payne's office. It set out the facts as established. The Arkwright report, commissioned by Payne on Fenwick's behalf in 1860 and absent from the file produced. The Forsyth valuation, the land registry confirmation of mineral rights attached to freehold, and Payne's advice to his client's heir to sell the property for £25 to £30. It requested a meeting to discuss the matter, noting that the alternative was a complaint to the Law Society and civil proceedings. Payne's response took 10 days, which was, Mr. Holt told Louisa, about right for a man doing the arithmetic. His response was not an admission. It was never going to be an admission. Men like Gerald Payne did not admit things. They negotiated. His solicitor, he had retained a York firm to deal with the matter, which was itself a form of acknowledgement, wrote to propose a settlement. The sum proposed was £1,000, in full and final resolution of any claims arising from the management of the Steinwick property. Louisa wrote back, through Mr. Holt, declined. The negotiation took 3 months. Payne's people went to 1,200, then 1,500, then 2,000. Louisa declined each figure. At 2,500, Mr. Holt told her she was close to the point where a court case became the rational alternative, and asked her how she felt about a court case. She said she felt fine about it. She had her father's letter. She had the Arkwright report with Payne's office on the cover page. She had the correspondence file with the report missing from it. She had the Forsyth valuation. She said, "Proceed to the Law Society complaint." The complaint was filed in February. 3 weeks later, Payne's solicitors proposed a settlement of £3,200. She accepted. The settlement was signed in March, on a day that happened to be bright and cold, the kind of early spring day that arrives in York before the trees have committed to it. She signed in Mr. Holt's Whitby office. She had come up from York on the morning train, and she walked out onto Church Street afterward and stood, for a moment in the cold sunshine, £3,200, and the property retained, the cottage, the 14 acres, the mineral rights attached to freehold. She had not sold. She had not taken the £30 and disappeared. She had gone to look for herself, as her father had hoped she would, and she had found what he had left for her, and she had not let them have it for less. She had the Forsyth valuation still to act on. A lease to a mining concern was not something she intended to rush. She wanted to understand the terms before she committed to them, and she had a solicitor she trusted and time she had not had before. She would take the spring to read and the summer to decide. The cottage she kept. This was not a financial decision. The cottage itself was not worth much as a building, but it was the right decision. Her father had gone there twice in the early years, and had sat in the study with the geological surveys and the Arkwright report, and had looked at the sea from the south window, and had thought about something he was not able to act on. And he had left his books on the shelf and his letter in the locked drawer, and had trusted her to come. She went in April, when the headland was still winter brown, but the sea had the first blue of the warming year in it. She swept the sitting room and lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and set the geological surveys back on the shelf in the order she had found them. And she sat in the cold sitting room for an afternoon, and looked out the south window at the headland stretching away toward the cliff edge, and below it the sea, and she thought about her father standing in this room, looking at the same view, holding the same knowledge, unable to find the way through it. He had found the way through in the end. Not directly, not in the clear, forward manner she would have preferred, not with the conversation she had not known they needed to have, but in the way available to him. A letter in a locked drawer, books on a shelf, a door left unlocked, and a daughter he had raised to look at what was actually in front of her. She took the key from her coat pocket and set it on the windowsill. The same key Mr. Payne had produced at the end of their meeting, worn smooth on the leather fob, the iron warm from her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket, where it had lived, apparently, for 12 years longer than anyone had known. The report was still on the shelf. She took it down that afternoon and read it one more time, slowly, in the light from the south window. 41 pages of careful Victorian prose about rock and seam and depth and yield. At the bottom of the last page, in the space below the engineer's conclusion, her father had written in pencil, "See to this, Lou, she had seen to it."